Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Shaler, the president of the Bibliographical Society of America, and it is my delight and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Elizaveta Strakhov is assistant professor of English at Marquette University. She received her A.B. degree magna cum laude from Harvard and her PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from Penn. Before Marquette, she was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in medieval French at Northwestern. How do I know Professor Strakhov and her work? She was a participant in my seminar on advanced medieval manuscript studies, a rare book school seminar taught at Yale in the Beinecke Library. It was then that I learned what an accomplished scholar she is and the nature of her interdisciplinary bibliographical research. Among her published works, I should note a book on Chaucer and one on John Lydgate, together with an array of articles on translation theory, multilingualism in the late Middle Ages, and the material text in the Francophone regions of medieval Europe. Professor Strakhov engages with hand-produced texts of the 14th and 15th centuries and explores especially the interactions among scribes and illuminators, authors and translators. She is speaking to us today about the scribal treatment of translation in bilingual texts as demonstrated in two late medieval, visually striking lyric manuscripts. Her presentation is entitled, "What Makes Bibliography Critical? A Medievalist Response." Welcome, Professor Strakhov.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. It is a true honor to be here, having nurtured my own scholarship on the work of the very scholars who have given this lecture before me. It was, in fact, Anne Blair who gave this same lecture in 2017, who introduced me to book history in an undergraduate seminar. And thank you so much to Barbara Shaler for her wonderful leadership of the Society, for inviting me to give this talk, and for that really warm introduction, and to Erin McGurl for helping organize the manifold logistics of this hybrid conference. Next slide, please. Thank you. On your screen, you'll find a sumptuous manuscript, the main subject of my talk. This is Grenoble Bibliothèque Municipale 873, and I wager you've probably never heard of it. Indeed, it has only ever been treated in one chapter in one book by the medievalist scholar Anne Coldiron, probably because it is a rather challenging manuscript. Its bulk consists of a selection of poetry by Charles d'Orléans, an early to mid 15th century poet with an unusual life story. Next slide. Nephew to King Charles VI of France, and thus in line for the French throne, Charles was captured at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 during the ongoing Hundred Years' War, a brutal, over-century-long conflict over succession between England and France. Due to his royal lineage, Charles spent 24 years under royal house arrest in England. In this time, he became a bilingual poet, writing hundreds of poems in both French and English. Now, our manuscript, Grenoble 873, does not include any of Charles's English verse. Next slide, please. But it is also very interested in bilingualism, as Charles's French poetry is given in a facing page Latin translation. Next slide. The author of this Latin translation is also this manuscript's compiler, Antonio Astezano, a minor figure in early mid-15th century humanist circles. Astezano, which means the man from Asti, was born in 1412, studied and taught at Pavia in Italy from the early 1430s, where he came into contact with humanists like Lorenzo Valla and Anneo Silvio Piccolomini. Asti, Astezano's home region, belonged to Charles d'Orléans via his Italian mother Valentina, daughter of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the powerful Duke of Milan. We know Charles traveled to Asti in 1447, and that Astezano lived in Charles's ducal household in France from 1450 to 53. Next slide. Throughout the manuscript, Astezano identifies himself as Charles d'Orléans' secretary. Here then, we have a manuscript of French poetry with a facing page Latin translation executed by an Italian humanist working for a French nobleman. Next slide. So, what is Grenoble 873 exactly? Is it French? Is it Latin? Is it Italian? Perhaps we're taking the wrong angle by focusing too much on the identities of the people involved. Let's try this manuscript instead from a bibliographical perspective. Where, for example, was it made? The last poem by Charles included by Astesano into the manuscript is dated 1453. And as we will later see, Astesano's arrangement of Charles's poetry closely follows that of Charles's own autograph manuscript of his French verse, kept in his ducal household. Next slide. This suggests that the Grenoble manuscript was at least started at Charles's ducal court in France. This is confirmed by marginalia reading Simon Caillot. This was a squire and amateur poet in Charles's ducal household. Next slide. The rest of the manuscript, however, consists of Latin writings by Astesano on various Italian events, such as an earthquake in Naples in 1456, a discussion of France's control over Genoa lasting from 1458 to 61, and elegiac verses addressed to the ruling classes of several minor northern Italian principalities. In Colophons, Astesano notes that he is writing the Latin text in Asti in the late 1450s. Next slide. The final work in the manuscript is a Latin poem by Astesano eulogizing the death of King Charles VII of France in 1461. So the manuscript contains texts that Astesano worked on in France in the early 1450s, in Italy in the late 1450s, and was completed around 1461. Next slide. We also note that the Latin works on Italian subjects that open and close Grenoble 873 have rubricated titles and colophons, while the Charles section of the manuscript does not, though space has been left for them. This small but important distinction reveals that the selection of Charles's work underwent a slightly different production process from the other Latin writings. This suggests that we are dealing with two separate compilations eventually brought together. Next slide. Nevertheless, the whole manuscript was decorated with a unified program to look like one cohesive whole. Next slide. Notably, this decoration is not characteristic of Italian humanist manuscripts from this period. Instead, Grenoble 873 looks like a courtly French manuscript, both in its Gothic Batad script and in its detailed vegetal decoration. So what is Grenoble 873? It is first and foremost a massive anthology of French poetry by Charles de Lion, containing 221 poems total. It is also a massive translation of 221 French poems into Latin, executed by an Italian humanist, but it's also clearly a collected works project for Astesano himself. It appears equally interested in French courtly poetry and in contemporary Italian politics. Yet, just to complicate matters still more, its Latin contents are dedicated not only to various Italian political figures, as noted earlier, but also to French political figures, like Charles de Lion himself, other members of his family, and King Charles VII of France. Its contents were sourced and composed both in France and Italy, but it was evidently put together and decorated in France. Next slide. Is this an Italian manuscript, a French manuscript, a Latin manuscript, a poetry anthology, a translation project, a work of political propaganda? Should we call it a manuscript of Charles de Lion's poetry or a collected works project of Antonio Astesano? Manuscripts such as these, I submit, are precisely the kind of material object that requires critical bibliography to make sense of them. But what is critical bibliography? That elusive, difficult term that has given its name to a whole society of fellows. Next slide. In 2016, in his lecture before this society's annual meeting, Michael Suarez made the following remarks regarding the tasks and aims of bibliography. The initial incomprehension characterizing our encounter with evidence that does not conform to our established interpretive practices may, if we are persistent, creative, and willing to take an intellectual risk or two, lead us to broader, more capacious understandings. I'd like to suggest to you that the animating question of bibliography is not what is the ideal text of Shakespeare. Rather, I think the question that preoccupies all of us is how did this book come to be the way it is? Indeed, as we just saw, asking this question of a manuscript like Grenoble 873 actively works against our predetermined authorial, codicological, formal, and other frameworks. Grenoble 873 pushes us to widen those frameworks, to whittle away at them. If you will indulge me, I'd like to build on Suarez's dictum. Next slide. Beyond how did this book come to be the way it is, I would also ask, how did this book come to be the way it is, and how do we know our answers to that question? Instead of bringing a set of frameworks and methodologies and presuppositions to a specific book object, how might we instead use a book object to challenge those frameworks and methodologies in the first place? To show you how this works is my goal for you today. Next slide. Now, I could have selected any number of generically, formally, and linguistically challenging manuscripts for my case study, but I have, as you may have suspected, chosen Grenoble 873 for a reason. Astesano's foregrounding of Charles's French poetry with a facing page Latin translation is striking first because of the extraordinary rarity of such a project for this period. The 15th century generally translates Latin works treating history, theology, natural philosophy, and the law into the vernacular, not vernacular secular poetry into Latin. But as I noted earlier, Astesano's translation project is also striking because of whose poetry he has chosen to Latinize. As you recall, Charles de Lion spent 24 years in English captivity. Now, most of his captors, being members of the English nobility, would have spoken fluent French. Nevertheless, Charles learned English as a second language so well that he composed a giant cycle of poetry in it. And this does not seem to have been a hobby for him born of lockdown, like baking your own sourdough bread. Next slide. In circa 1440, just before his release from captivity, Charles commissioned the production of two manuscripts of his collected works. One of these, now Bibliothèque nationale de France, Fonds Français MS 25458, is a massive 303 folio collection of his French poetry, with numerous sections written in Charles's own hand. Copied by French scribes, but partially decorated by an English illustrator, BNF 25458 offers a fitting testament to Charles's Anglo-French early life. The second, London British Library Harley MS 682, is a 148 folio collection of his English poetry. Charles left this English collection, Harley 682, behind in England and took the French collection, BNF 25458, to France. Next slide. Over the subsequent decades, BNF 25458 became a kind of poetry album for Charles and the many illustrious visitors to his ducal court. Not only did he continue adding new French and Latin poetry, but Charles encouraged his guests, most famously François Villon, to write in poetry of their own. The overwhelming bulk of scholarly work on Charles treats the French poetry collection and Charles's relationship to the numerous French poets, particularly François Villon, who contributed to it. For decades, Mary Jo Arne was the primary and all but only scholar working on Charles's English poetry. Next slide. This despite the fact that Charles's English poetry, which scholars following Arne collectively entitle Fortunstabelnis, is a cohesive, intricately organized cycle of over 200 lyrics. It brims with references to other French and English poets like Guillaume de Machaut, Christine de Pizan, Geoffrey Chaucer, and John Gower. This means that Charles de Lion is the author of arguably one of the earliest and longest late medieval cycles of English poetry. I emphasize arguably, because despite the remarkable size and breadth of Fortune's stableness, Charles de Lion is not and has never been considered an English poet. In fact, earlier 20th century scholars assumed that Fortune's stableness was the work of some unnamed English translator. Even after Mary Jo Arndt disproved this, it took until 2020 for the appearance of the first edited volume of scholarship devoted to Charles's English verse. Literally left behind in England, Charles's English poetry also got left behind by scholarship. Next slide. Charles de Lyon's scholarly fate highlights two interrelated tendencies against which modern scholarship on the period has begun to push back. First, the tendency to pigeonhole multilingual figures into some canonical tradition defined by contemporary rather than medieval geographic borders. Charles is from France and a French poet, so his English output must automatically be secondary to his life's work. Second, the tendency, shared by Anglo and French scholars alike, to view England specifically as vastly separate from continental Europe. After all, when we think of late medieval English poetic production, we think of Chaucer, Gower, the Gawain poet, William Langland, John Lydgate, homegrown, homespun Englishmen writing on homegrown, homespun English topics. But Charles de Lyon's English output is comparable to any of these poets in its formal and thematic complexity, as scholarship by Mary Jo Arndt, Artis Butterfield, Susan Crane, Anne Coldiron, Julia Boffey, and others has revealed. In this way, the classification challenges posed by Grenoble 873, is it French, Italian, a poetry collection, a translation project, mirror in miniature still bigger classification challenges in our scholarship. What do we even do with a bilingual poet in the first place? To whose national canon does a bilingual poet belong? As the remainder of my talk will show, the challenges of classification posed by Grenoble 873 as a manuscript, and the challenges of classification posed by its primary subject, the poet Charles de Lion, are not coincidental. Grenoble 873 is a difficult manuscript because it is dealing with a difficult poet. Thus, trying to understand Grenoble 873 from a critical bibliographical standpoint, a standpoint that impels us to think around traditional bibliographical categories, may also help us think around the traditional categories with which we approach authors, their geographies, their languages, and their canonization. Next slide. Let's look at Grenoble 873 even more closely. Astazano arranges the French text on the left, the Latin on the right. Each new text of French and Latin opens with two-line illuminated initials, blue for the French, red for the Latin. This is followed by red and blue penwork initials that either mirror each other across the page or else invert each other. Next slide. Care has been taken to fit discrete French works with their Latin translations to a page as much as possible, so that the number of lines per page changes depending on content rather than exhibit uniform ruling throughout. In the process, the Latin text, often far more concise than its French counterpart, receives additional spacing when it ends up shorter than the French. In this way, the French and Latin appear visually as interoperable linguistic systems. Astazano invites the reader to read back and forth comparatively in order to experience a French poet in lofty Latin and also clearly to marvel at the elegance of Astazano's own Latin verse. Next slide. Astazano suggests as much in a Latin prologue. He explains that he has performed the translation since I was feeling vexed that only France knew that so great a prince had so great a talent. For surely this wonderful talent of the prince demands that the whole wide earth know it. Astazano goes on to compare Charles to the Latin poet Ovid. Often I had admired Ovid's book of verse that he had written as an exile in Pontus, but I cease to marvel at so great a poet when I read those songs of the imprisoned prince. I have taken it upon myself, therefore, to translate this book into Latin verses. Next slide. Continuing to compare Charles to the illustrious greats of classical antiquity, Astazana also makes a sly bid for his own transhistorical relevance. I reckon it to be, for me, as great an honor to execute in Latin the French writings of that prince as it was for the translator who made Latin books from the Greek books that the great Aristotle wrote, or that the first of poets Homer sung, or that the genius of Plutarch produced. Astazano's invocation of classical translation, general focus on classical antiquity, and emphasis on Charles and his own relationship as moderns to the classical canon is fully in line with contemporary late medieval Italian and French humanist thinkers such as Lorenzo Valla, Leonardo Bruni, and Niccolò Rem. Next slide. At the same time as he Latinizes and humanizes Charles, Astazano also Italianizes him. We may recall that Astazano's selection of Charles's work is framed by lengthy Latin writings on Italian politics. Astazano also selects a pointed title for Charles. Throughout the compilation, Astazano calls Charles Dux Aurelianensius et Mediolanus, or Duke of Orleans and Milan. Now, to be clear, Charles d'Orléans was not the actual Duke of Milan. Next slide. But he was the maternal grandson of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, Duke of Milan. We recall that Astazano is compiling this manuscript in the 1450s and early 1460s based on internal dating. Significantly, in 1447, the patrilineal line, Visconti line, died out. In the ensuing power vacuum, Francesco Sforza seized control of Milan, inaugurating a long period of Sforza family rule. To proclaim Charles the Duke of Milan in the 1450s is to insist that the Visconti line is still alive. So Astazano's Charles emerges before us a humanistically Latinized, intentionally Italianized, and altogether politicized figure. Next slide. So when Astazano ends his selection of Charles's verse with a lengthy section of political poetry by Charles, that decision fits with Astazano's broader portrayal of this poet. This section contains items such as a lament over the Hundred Years' War impact on France, a prayer for peace, and, as the final work of the selection, a poem celebrating the waning fortunes of the English on the continental theater of war. In her analysis of Astazano's organization of Charles's verse, therefore, Anne Coldiron suggests that Astazano has intentionally reorganized Charles's work for, quote, a decidedly patriotic, even a nationalistic revision of his oeuvre, end quote. Coldiron contends that Astazano's compilation heavily rearranges Charles's poetry with respect to earlier manuscripts. As a result, she argues, his earlier poems, which thematize love, are sidelined for the, quote, more serious issues of France's military supremacy to portray a brand new, politicized Charles invested in French proto-nationalism on a broader European arena. Next slide. However, Coldiron's fascinating take on Grenoble predates Mary Jo Arndt's groundbreaking study of the complex codicological organization of BNF 25458. This, we recall, is the autograph manuscript of Charles's French work that he commissioned in England, brought back with him to France, and continued working on for the rest of his life. Arndt's meticulous studies permit far more in-depth consideration of Grenoble's codicological arrangement in comparison with BNF 25458. This comparison, in turn, points to a far closer relationship between the two manuscripts than heretofore posited. This alters our understanding of what Astazano is doing with that final political section on the Hundred Years' War. Next slide. As we may recall, besides BNF 25458, Charles also commissioned the English poetry compilation Harley 682 at the same time, prior to leaving England. Despite being written in two different languages, both manuscripts are organized very similarly. Charles is in England, he's in love with a lady, she passes away, he renounces love, and organizes himself a former retirement from love's service. The effect of this identical order between both manuscripts is striking. Both offer the same autobiographical account of Charles's life in English captivity, once in English and once in French, reifying the extent to which Charles understood his time in English captivity and his acquired Anglo-French bilingualism as constitutive of his poetic identity. After the account of retirement from love's service, the manuscripts diverge. Harley 682 continues with the account of a second love affair with a lady in England. These poems are all original English compositions, as if linguistically reifying a sort of acceptance of life in England. 25458, however, continues with a lengthy section of poems in which Charles discusses the Hundred Years' War, seeks peace, and rails briefly against the English. This section also contains numerous entreaties to Charles's political supporters on the continent to help him negotiate his release from English captivity. Thereafter, there's a clear codicological break, and the rest of the manuscript, copied in France over multiple later decades, contains that poetic record of visitors like Francois Villon to Charles's ducal court noted earlier. Put otherwise, together the textual organization of the two manuscripts conceptually narrates the story of Charles's two lives, his life in England and his life in France. Next slide. Astesano's textual organization participates in the same conceptual project. Astesano opens with the pledge to serve love, just like the other two manuscripts. Then we get 71 French ballades and the interlude of retirement from love's service. Next slide. The organization is not a perfect match everywhere with 25458, but as you can see, it is very, very close. The overwhelming majority of the works that Astesano has selected occur, furthermore, in the first 120 pages of 25458. Next slide. Meanwhile, the last section of Astesano's compilation, with the political poems that seemed so radically transformative, displacing love for politics, still just follows 25458, in which those poems occur in largely the same order from pages 194 to 232. Rather than uniquely reconfiguring Charles's work, as Koldyrin suggested, Astesano is actually very closely following BNF 25458. Next slide. What makes this hard to see is that Astesano has intercut the ballade sequences lifted from 25458 with sequences of Charles's chansons. However, the chansons simply represent the very next discrete section of 25458, pages 235 to 335, which Astesano has split up and reshuffled backwards into the compilation. All of this suggests that Astesano is sourcing his poems and working directly with 25458. This means, in turn, that Astesano is not reorganizing Charles's work ab ovo. Instead, he is reproducing Charles's own curation of his work. By choosing to move the chanson sequence, which in 25458 occurs after the sequence telling the story of Charles's release from English captivity, Astesano certainly, as Koldyrin argues, ends his selection of Charles's work on an emphatically political, Hundred Years' War-centered note. For Koldyrin, this decision suggests Astesano's elision of the cycle's earlier love concerns for quote-unquote more serious political ones. I want to build on this idea. Next slide. Astesano is taking 25458, a compilation telling the story of Charles's life in English captivity and eventual release, a compilation intentionally designed as the French companion volume to an English compilation telling the English version of the same story. By following 25458 so closely, Astesano repeats in Latin this same narrative already told before, once in English and once in French. By moving the chanson section back, furthermore, Astesano makes Charles's English captivity and its eventual end the culmination of his selection of Charles's work. By doing so in a manuscript that is also, as we just saw, deliberately crafting a Latinized and Italianized Charles, Astesano insists unlike many contemporary scholars of Charles's oeuvre, on the indelible significance of Charles's 24 years in England to his identity. Astesano underscores that Charles's autobiographical narrative of English imprisonment and release is worth telling in Latin to the Italian humanist world to which Astesano himself belongs. For Astesano, Charles's English captivity is not a footnote to Charles's life, nor a stint of poetic juvenilia. It is instead the formative experience of a cosmopolitan poet read by humanists and the formative experience of an Italian statesman. Next slide. As remarkable as the importance Astesano places on Charles's time in England may seem, coming from the pen of an Italian humanist, it is not unique. We find a similar emphasis occurring independently in René d'Anjou's Livre du Cœur d'un Mépris, dated 1457, the same year we know Astesano is working on the Grenoble compilation. Like Charles, René d'Anjou, Duke of Anjou, Count of Provence, and King of Naples, was a prominent member of the French nobility and a noted courtly poet. Next slide. Here, the main character walks through a giant cemetery of illustrious authors and poets. Their tombs bear inscriptions proclaiming the salient features of their lives for their enduring poetic legacy. Charles's tomb is included, and it bears the following inscription: "I was taken by the English and led into bondage, and I spent so long there that I learned the language, by means of which I grew close to a beautiful and virtuous lady. And I was so taken with her that I pledged fealty to love, about which I composed beautiful deeds that were all the more praised." According to these verses, it was through learning English in captivity that Charles ended up composing highly lauded poetry in the first place. So for René d'Anjou, it is Charles's acquisition of English that establishes his enduring legacy for French audiences. Next slide. Rethinking Astesano's aims with the Grenoble compilation offers additional purchase to Astesano's comparison of Charles to classical figures in his prologue that we saw earlier. Notice that the first thing Astesano tells us about Charles is that he was imprisoned. Earlier, we had read Astesano's comparison of Charles to Ovid in exile as a classicizing gambit, fitting for a man in humanist circles. Next slide. But now it might provocatively recall the French poet Eustache Deschamps' famous address to Geoffrey Chaucer, one of the English poets extensively cited by Charles in his own English work. In the opening lines of his address, Deschamps compares Chaucer to a whole pantheon of figures from classical antiquity precisely because Chaucer translates poetry from French to English while in England. This poem also contains a giant amount of quotations from one of Ovid's Black Sea letters, a fascinating intertext, given Astesano's association of Charles with Ovid in exile, that I could talk to you about in the Q&A if you're interested. Next slide. Astesano's emphasis on classical antiquity also reminds us of a short Latin poem about Chaucer's contemporary, John Gower, also cited by Charles in his poetry. Famously, Gower composed his major life's work in 3 languages, French, Latin, and English. Appended to a variety of manuscripts of Gower's works, Aeneas Bucolius praises Gower. Here, as you can see, Gower's poetry surpasses that of Virgil because where Virgil wrote 3 great works, Gower, the poet says, wrote 3 great works in 3 different languages. This moment intriguingly resonates with Astesano's claim that Charles's literary production in England surpasses that of Ovid in exile on the Black Sea, and that Charles's exilic experiences have in turn motivated Astesano to translate Charles's French into Latin. Next slide. To be clear, I am not suggesting that Astesano has necessarily read Deschamps' Ballade to Chaucer or this Latin poem about Gower. I'm suggesting instead that we consider carefully Astesano's choice to end his selection of Charles's work with poems about Charles's departure from England. I suggest we see this as evidence that Astesano is thinking seriously about Charles's residence in England as foundational to his entry into the literary pan-European canon. Astesano's invocation of classical figures from antiquity fits with his own Italian humanist context. But we might also consider England, with its own rich literary history of multilingualism and translation activity, as a space that might offer inspiration to continental poets invested in thinking through multilingualism and translation in their own work. Next slide. I'd like to end by briefly discussing a final moment in the history of Charles d'Orléans' reception that continues to highlight how, on the one hand, Charles's later audiences understood his English captivity to be the most salient feature of his poetry, and on the other, how England's cultural ties to continental Europe only grew closer over the 15th century. In London British Library MS Royal 16F2, we discover yet another visually stunning collection of Charles d'Orléans' poetry. This glorious manuscript was begun in the early 1480s for King Edward IV and completed in the 1490s for King Henry VII. Although made for English Tudor audiences, this manuscript, like many of the numerous other French texts in the Tudor royal libraries, was produced in northern France and Flanders. Next slide. Notably, like Grenoble, this manuscript also collects Charles's French verse, 163 poems total. Like Grenoble, it also demonstrates a clear reliance in its textual organization on the opening section of BNF 25458, whether directly or through intermediary copies. Thus, we find yet another manuscript collecting not the poetry that Charles wrote after his release from captivity at his ducal court, but the poetry he wrote during his English captivity. Next slide. Although commissioned and produced for an explicitly English audience this time, the decoration choices of Royal 16F2 reveal another reception project oddly congruent in its emphases with that of Astesano. Beyond intricate initials and line fillers, the manuscript contains 3 full-page miniatures. Next slide. The first, which we just saw, decorates the first work in the compilation, the narrative poem that is also placed first in BNF 25458, in Grenoble, and in the English manuscript Harley 682. Next slide. The second famous full-page miniature illustrates the opening lines of Charles's poem De Nouvelles d'Albion, concerning news from Albion. In the final years of his captivity, Charles was permitted to travel to the continent in order to work with his political allies to raise the enormous ransom he needed to win back his freedom. In De Nouvelles d'Albion, Charles is relating to his main ally, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, that he has successfully returned to England and is progressing steadily in his negotiations. Next slide. The artist has depicted Charles sitting by the window in the Tower of London on the Thames with the London Bridge in the background and ships sailing off into the margins. This evocative image of Charles leaning over the water that could carry him out the Thames and across the English Channel to France is a fitting and striking illustration for a poem describing Charles's literally suspended state of anticipation as he waits in England for news of his release after a recent trip abroad. Next slide. The third full-page miniature, meanwhile, illustrates a poem in which Charles critiques France for falling into a damnable state of moral decay and corruption. Notably, in the final verse of this poem, Charles explains the circumstances in which he penned the verses. I wrote them while in prison, I confess, praying to God that before I am an old man, peace on earth might come to pass. Here again, the artists decorating this manuscript have chosen to place a full-page illustration at a work that deals with the 100 Years' War and, still more significantly, deals with the ache and hurt of Charles's longtime English captivity. Next slide. Notably, this same work is similarly visually foregrounded with a full-page decoration in Grenoble 873. Next slide. In this manuscript, ultimately destined for English audiences, the visual emphasis on works specifically thematizing Charles's English captivity and France's wartime state of moral decay accrues an obvious proto-nationalist aim. Nevertheless, proto-nationalistic as they may be here, The engagements of this Tudor manuscript with Charles's English captivity also resonate substantially with the similar engagements of Charles's autograph manuscript and Astesano's Grenoble compilation. In this way, even as it thematizes England for an English audience, Royal 16F2 also reveals itself as participating in an established continental reception of Charles's work that is deeply interested in Charles's English captivity. And this is fitting for a manuscript that, though destined for the English Royal Library, was produced in northeastern French-speaking continental Europe on the model of BNF 25458. Next slide. Royal 16F2 reminds us that even expressions of partisan Englishness on behalf of English audiences, expressions that we automatically associate with our pervasive sense of English insularity, particularly for this period, can also be understood as playing out continental European perspectives on England. In turn, this kind of enlarged understanding of what England signifies, to whom England signifies, and for whom England signifies can productively transform our sense of what nationalism, partisanship, and by extension, canonicity might look like. Next slide. The last slide. I have arrived at this conclusion, at this questioning of whether and how Charles d'Orléans' own contemporaries understood him as a quote-unquote French poet, by looking closely at the bibliographical features of manuscripts. As you may have noticed, despite taking poets as my subject, I've offered you very little literary analysis throughout this talk. Instead, I have attempted to probe the issues of nationalism, canon, and literary reception surrounding Charles d'Orléans by thinking exclusively about the visual and organizational choices made by manuscript compilers of his work. In so doing, I aim to offer you a case study in critical bibliography as I understand and practice it, namely as the analysis of bibliographical features for the purpose of disrupting the methodological categories by which our scholarship operates. Critical bibliography sees in every book a Pandora's box that can explode our understanding of books themselves, of the hybrid cultural currents from which they emerge, and of how we categorize books, authors, and literary traditions in the first place. And how to open that Pandora's box a crack is what I hope I have been able to show for you today. Thank you.
There you go.
Hi, welcome back. I'm here with Barbara Shaler.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And I learned a lot about the challenges of multilingual texts and the issues that you presented on French, English, Latin, and was struck by the visual images you presented to us to buttress your argument. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to discuss a little bit about where you're going further with this. I know that your plan is to publish an essay in the papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, and we're very excited about that. But beyond that, it seems to me that you have the beginning of another book. At least it looks to me like you're moving into bigger territory than one poet. You're moving into the territory of the differences, both paleographically, codicologically, in terms of decoration of multilingual manuscripts. So I'm wondering if you could maybe expand just a little bit about where you want to go.
That's such a great question. Thank you so much. So I can't decide. I definitely have one book project in mind that is thinking about thinking about scribes and their treatment of scribes like Astesano and also sort of scribes more removed from the text that they're copying, is thinking about how how scribes deal with translation in terms of their mise en page and their rubrics and the marginal notes that they write in the presenting of those texts. So Daniel Wakeland has this fabulous book, Scribal Correction and Literary Craft, and I basically want to do that, but for scribes who are working with translated text. Wakeland argued that scribes are more than just rote copiers of the text. They're actually, bringing editorial theory and ideas to the works themselves and shaping them as collaborative authors. And I want to pursue that line of thinking with scribes that are working specifically with longstanding translated traditions, and to think about how scribes think of copying as a form of translation conceptually and insert themselves into larger translation discourses happening. Now, the difficulty is I'm still trying to figure out where I want to direct my attention. I have this one fascination with the secretum secretorum tradition, where you see this happening in the manuscripts really intensely. And I also have this obsession with Charles de Lion, as you know, and I keep writing on him. I can't leave him behind. And I also have a sort of a general obsession with the perception of England on the continent, which is what this talk has been really focused on, because if you start looking at people like Humphrey of Gloucester has Italian humanists. He is commissioning Italian humanists to write praise of the English in the 100 Years' War. You have French and Italian people really thinking and writing a lot about the 100 Years' War from both French, either upholding the French side or the English side. There's a lot more conversations about England happening on the continent than I think we have, at least than English medievalists have been focused on recently. And I can't tell if that's like its own book project of which Charles de Lion and Astezano are going to be a part, or if Charles de Lion and Astezano are a part of this other book project that is about scribes and translated texts. So either this is one giant project together, or it's two slightly separate things.
So you take on.
So I would like to remind everyone that I'm moderating a question and answer period that also takes questions from our audience. So there is a Q&A button on your screen, and if you want to submit a question, please do. And I can ask our speaker, Dr. Strakhov. In the meantime, I have a question for you. And I'm wondering, you are a professor of English literature. You come from a comparative literature background. And, I think clearly teaching is a important other part of your practice in addition to scholarly work. And for this audience, questions about pedagogy and bibliography in the classroom are really of the utmost importance. So how did you learn the kinds of skills that you bring to bear in your research? And how do you think that maybe comparative literature programs, for instance, might benefit from more bibliographical instruction?
Oh, that is such a fabulous question, because actually, yeah, my comparative literature program at Penn was phenomenal, and very focused on literary theory, which was really helpful in terms of thinking around traditional nationalistic categories. I drew a lot ultimately on post-colonial theory in my thinking, and in my formation as a scholar. But when it came, so I was hosted by the English department for my dissertation project, and I had a committee composed of English and French medievalists. And I realized that I wanted to work on this manuscript because I was reading about Anglo-French connections, and this call number popped up, this shelf mark, University of Pennsylvania, Codex 902. And I was like, well, I'm in not Raynor, that's Marquette. I'm in Van Pelt Library, and University of Pennsylvania, Codex 902 must be right upstairs in the manuscript section of the library. So I sort of toddled up there and called it up, not knowing anything about how to look at manuscripts, and stared at it and realized that it was amazing and fascinating and totally exploding my understanding of everything that I thought I knew about English and French texts. And but then I didn't know how to read it. So, and my program didn't offer me any bibliographical training. So I just am an autodidact. I taught myself how to do everything with the help of the Kislak Center at Penn's, the wonderful staff there, who basically gave me an ad hoc tutorials on the basis of this manuscript. I spent my entire fourth year of graduate school, like going to the archives every single day, teaching myself, armed with a bunch of books, like how you actually read a manuscript. And it was then only years later that I ended up even going to the Rare Book School and taking courses with Consuela Duchke and Barbara Shaler, after I'd already sort of spent this time doing it on my own. Since then, I will say that Penn has greatly, the Kislak Center has become this force on campus. And there's an enormous amount of bibliographical training available to medievalists now, which was just starting up towards the end of my time at Penn. But I think that, I truly think, I mean, this is also why I'm in the Society of Fellows for Critical Bibliography. I truly think that bibliography helps absolutely everybody. I teach a history of the book class, which is a senior capstone at Marquette, in which the students come to the class with their own various sets and interests. We do a crash course in bibliography from the Mesopotamian tablet to the tablet, as I sweepingly and jokingly, but very seriously call it. And then the students spend the second half of the semester building a project around an item in special collections at Marquette. And that item can be medieval, it can be early modern, we have all sorts of things. And it could also be 20th century. We have the Stephen Sondheim archives, for example. We have Tolkien archives. We have an enormous amount of stuff. And what I found doing it this way is that no matter what a student's disciplinary background or interests are, no matter what they come to that class thinking they want to do, they can always bring book history into any one of their subjects. So I've had people working on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and on the Catholic workers movement, and on instructions for like manuals for Irish immigrants in the 19th century on how to be good servants, all amazing, rich projects that come out of one single book. So my real aim is, and hope is, that everybody can bring a little bit of book history to anything that they teach, whether it's English, French, Latin, etc. Because whatever period you're teaching, whatever your students are interested in, they're going to love rare books, and they can build really provocative projects around them.
That was a really inspiring and exciting response, especially to hear how you're doing this in the classroom. We had a couple of issues with the question and answer bit online, so I'm just catching up with what's coming in. But Barbara and I have another question for you, which is, in your talk, you focus so much on the national tradition, as you said, and how do those national traditions matter? And why do they matter? Especially thinking of yesterday's session on the bibliographical study of maps in books. One of the points that a speaker made was about how the importance of text beside the map if you don't know the territory. So that really, what is the relationship? It makes me think about people and places, and how a place can imprint itself on a person in a way that it doesn't actually imprint itself on the land, especially the way that people think about that. So a lot of lead up, but how and why do national traditions matter in your work?
I think that that's such a great question. And I love the idea of a place imprinting itself on a person, which is exactly what clearly happened to Charles d'Orléans, and even more fascinatingly was picked up on by other people receiving his work later. So I would say, national traditions matter in my work, in the sense that I'm constantly trying to break them down. They're like this thing I'm constantly fighting against. Well, because they're fascinating. They are fascinating. National traditions have a history to them. They arise in particular times and places. And understanding, getting behind that moment of origin is really striking and really interesting and really redefines how our own scholarship works. We focus on these. I think about this a lot because as Barbara Shaler's little biography of me revealed, right? I've worked in both a French department as well as an English department. I have a comparative literature background. I'm also personally somebody who was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm bilingual myself in Russian and English. So I think a lot about what it means to belong to a place, especially a place that's not on the map anymore. I feel very acutely the fact that I was born in the Soviet Union and that that country no longer exists. And what does it mean to be from a place that's not on the map? And in turn, what then does it mean to study people like Charles d'Orléans who are from places that are not on the map on maps as currently drawn today, or who have all these connections to all these different places currently divided by traditional borders, which are imaginary and illusory ultimately. And so my first book that actually just came out, like physically in the world about 14 days ago now, it's called Continental England, which is a purposefully defamiliarizing title because England is not continental. But the point of the book is that England's occupation of France during the 100 Years' War and its various incursions into France during the 100 Years' War completely changes the way in which England gets perceived by continental Europe. And it becomes this sort of monolithic, this monolithic military juggernaut, but also nevertheless this place that is culturally still subservient to France. So it reduces this paradox that continental Europeans and English people are really wrestling with. What does it mean to have an island country that is suddenly on the continent? So I guess anyways, my sort of wishy-washy answer is that the nationalistic traditions exist for me as something to be ultimately queried, questioned, and cast down because they're so bound up with both medieval and modern political ideologies, and with histories and with discursive histories, and disentangling those is sort of the ethos of my entire scholarship.
Thank you. Well, we don't have any other questions from our audience, so I think we're going to wrap it up with that. Barbara and I want to thank you, Lisa, for this really fabulous talk. It's so clear how much preparation went into this, and I'm so glad that we could share your really brilliant scholarship with our audience today. And I so can't wait to read the paper in PBSA. So please take a quick break. We'll be back in about
5 minutes.
We'll be back in about 20 minutes for the start. Sorry, what time does our next bit start?
2:45.
2:45. Yeah, we have a 20-minute break. So we will see you again at 2:45 for the annual meeting. Please do come back. It is a very important moment, which is the election of officers and the council class of 2025, and some great news about our fellowship programs and awards and other really exciting news, a special surprise even. So stick around. See you in 20 minutes.